Yes. I just wanted to give you some more context on the Federal Reserve System. You should have heard the Federal Reserve System in that course that you just read, right? How many of you prior to that had heard that term, Federal Reserve? Hands. Okay. Does anyone want to summarize what they knew about the Federal Reserve? What did we interpret that term, Federal Reserve, to mean? Has to do with money. All right, that's a start. It has to do with money. Did we know anything else about the Federal Reserve? Besides that it has to do with money. What do you think?
Nationwide.
Okay, it's a nationwide thing that has to do with money. So, Federal Reserve System has 3 different parts, and they're on the board behind me, so I'm going to quickly walk you through those parts. Your reading mentioned some elements of this, but didn't give you lots of detail, so these are some of the details. So when you hear Federal Reserve, it really means 3 different things, and you see those 3 written up here. There's the Federal Open Market Committee. So one of the 3 parts of the Federal Reserve is this committee of people. The second part, probably what you associate most with money, Henry, is the system of Federal Reserve banks. There are 12 all across the country. One of them is in Boston. Does anyone know where in Boston? Downtown, in the financial district, which makes sense. It's right across the street from South Station, actually, the Federal Reserve Bank in Boston. So we are one of 12 cities that have Federal Reserve banks. The third part, so we have the Federal Open Market Committee, the Reserve Banks, and then something called the Board of Governors, or sometimes it's called the Federal Reserve Board. 3 parts. The president picks the people on this board. Each bank has a president, so there are 12 banks across the country, and each bank has a president. That committee is made up of people from the Board of Governors and the presidents of these banks. Yes?
But there's actually 12 banks across.
Yes, there are actually 12 Federal Reserve banks. Boston has one of them, but there's a Federal Reserve Bank in San Francisco, in Dallas, in Minneapolis.
Wait, and is it just like a regular bank? Like, Bank of America?
So they're referred to as bankers' banks, so their function is a little bit different, which is an important part of why we're talking about the Federal Reserve. So, reserve banks both hold money, so they have vaults of money and things, but the Federal Reserve System determines the overall interest rate. So banks loan money to us, right? How do banks make money? Can anyone tell me that?
Interest rate.
Interest rates. Don't they pay us interest rates? They don't?
Yes.
No, they do.
Okay, so what's an example of the way a bank pays us interest, Sophia?
So if you like continue to what's it called? Put money in your account or something, like every month or something, or I don't really know. They just like add, give you back a lot. Not a lot. I don't really know. Am I answering your question?
You are. I'm a little distracted by Shy, who's bobbing up and down and talking. What's going on back there? You okay? I just keep seeing your head come up and then go back down. So you're ignorant. Okay. So they give us money when we put our money in the bank, right?
Yeah.
Do we ever pay them interest?
Yeah, of course.
On what?
When we put our money in, there's no. They pay us interest rate.
So if I put my money in the bank, I can pay them for that?
No, they pay you.
They pay me. So when do I pay them?
When you lend out a mortgage.
Okay, when I borrow money. When I borrow money from them, right? So, so bankers' banks, the Federal Reserve banks, loan money out to banks that we get money from. So there's an interest rate that the Federal Reserve sets. And the interest that we pay, or we get paid, from our individual banks, is determined by the federal interest rate.
Oh, that's not really.
So if the federal interest rate is set at a certain place, then our ability to either borrow money or get paid interest changes as that rate changes. Does that make sense? So these banks are called bankers' banks because banks have to adjust their rates based on the Federal Reserve banks. Yes.
Wait, so do the other banks borrow money from the reserve banks? Is that what you're saying?
So their bank rates are determined by the Federal Reserve rates.
So what exactly do the reserve banks do then? Are they just
They loan money like banks do, yes, but
to
they're
like anyone, or is it?
to banks.
Okay.
Yes.
So does the federal bank decide the interest rate for, I don't know, America?
So the Federal Reserve in general determines the interest rate for
For all banks?
our country, and then all banks adjust to that Federal Reserve rate.
What
So,
do you mean by adjust that rate?
so if the Federal Reserve raises interest rates, then yes, banks like Bank of America have to adjust their rates accordingly. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Question.
What is the interest rate?
So save that question because we're going to talk later about specific interest rates. We'll get into that when we talk about different accounts, okay? So what we're talking about, some of your questions are really getting to the point of like, what does this do? What does the Federal Reserve System do? And there are two different kinds of policy. You've probably heard these words in politics, if you follow news, fiscal and monetary. Does anyone know the difference between the word fiscal policy and monetary policy? They're fancy big words, but they have somewhat basic meanings. If you hear President Obama talking, is he talking about fiscal policy or monetary policy?
Monetary. Fiscal.
Fiscal. So fiscal policy is not something that the Federal Reserve controls. Fiscal policy is what President Obama is dealing with, what our Congress and political figures in our country deal with. So things like tax rates, saving, spending, budget, all of that stuff about our country, that's fiscal policy. Monetary policy is about how our economy is performing. So interest rates in your reading were given a bit of a metaphor. So they said it's kind of like driving a car. Can anyone explain that? How are interest rates like driving a car? Henry.
But if you put on the brakes, it slows down the economy, and then if you lower the interest rate, it speeds up the economy.
Exactly. So interest rates are like the gas pedal on a car, is what that reading said. So if you are changing the interest rate, it's like either putting on the gas or putting on the brakes in a car. Monetary policy deals with that kind of decision. So the goal of the Federal Reserve is called this dual mandate. It's two things. We want to have the ability to have employment. So full employment would be the goal. Everyone having a job. And we want to have stable prices of things in our economy. And the interest rate changing is a way for the Federal Reserve to try and help our economy have that stability, or help our economy get where it needs to go. Does that make some sense? So these three parts work together to try and achieve that goal, to make decisions about monetary policy. Not about taxes, not about fiscal policy, like where we spend our money. Should we spend our money on the military or not? But about monetary policy, issues of the economy. Make sense? This was slightly mentioned in your reading, but not mentioned in detail. I just wanted to give you a little bit more detail about the parts that make it up. They mentioned Alan Greenspan, right? Do you know who he is? Who is he still?
No.
Who is now?
They didn't say who was it.
She was in the news a lot.
Oh,
Janet Yellen. So Janet Yellen was formerly the president of the San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank. I met her in San Francisco once. When she was the federal, ask me that later when we are at your table, okay? So the the Federal Reserve presidents can move up to a bigger position. So the chairman of the whole Federal Reserve now is a former Reserve Bank president, Janet Yellen. Alan Greenspan held that title in the past, but is no longer chairman of the Fed. Does that make sense? So this was in the news when you were dealing with stocks a few weeks ago. They were making a decision about what would happen with the interest rates. What eventually happened? Did they raise them or lower them or keep them?
Raise them.
What happened? They kept them the way that they were. There was debate about raising them, but they ended up keeping the interest rate where it was. And the stock market reacted to that. One of the questions I want you to answer, you're going to quickly answer 2 questions in an assignment on Canvas. One is just to help me understand what you understand about interest rates. The second is, did you see any reaction in your stocks to issues around the interest rate earlier this month, okay? So you're going to answer those 2 questions now, and then you have some time to work on EverFi Module 1, trading, or your investing reflection. I'll come around and answer questions if you have them.